The morning had started like most others since my retirement, quietly, predictably, comfortably dull. I was sitting in the breakfast nook of my townhouse just outside Princeton, the autumn light slanting through the window and landing across the oak table my wife and I had bought decades earlier. The coffee had gone lukewarm beside me. I hadn't noticed. I was reviewing quarterly statements from my investment accounts, more out of habit than necessity. After 42 years as a structural engineer, discipline didn't disappear just because the office key had been returned. My name is Edward Mallory. I'm 66 years old, widowed for 5, financially secure. Or at least, that's what I believed that morning. The phone rang at 9:17 a.m. I glanced at the caller ID and frowned slightly. Harlan and Company, attorneys at law, specifically Jonathan Harlan. Jonathan had been my attorney for nearly 20 years. He handled my estate planning, trust reviews, and everything that came with preparing for the inevitable. He was meticulous to the point of irritation. He never called without scheduling first. I answered on the second ring. Edward, Jonathan said, without preamble, I need you to come in today. Something in his tone made me straighten in my chair. What's happened? I asked. There's been a development involving your late wife's accounts, he said carefully. One we weren't previously aware of. My fingers tightened around the phone. Laura's estate was closed 4 years ago. Yes, he replied. That's what concerns me. There was a pause. I could hear papers shifting on his end, the faint hum of his office printer. Are you alone? He asked. Yes. Good. I'd rather explain this in person, but I'll say this much. A financial instrument linked to your wife was flagged during a routine audit last week. It wasn't disclosed during probate. And Edward, it's active. Active. Laura had died of ovarian cancer after an 18-month battle that stripped her down to something fragile and quiet. I'd held her hand as she took her last breath. There had been nothing left unresolved. Or so I thought. What kind of instrument? I asked. Jonathan hesitated. A trust-adjacent holding account. Offshore adjacent, but legal. Substantial. How substantial? Another pause. Longer this time. 7 figures. I closed my eyes. I'll be there, I said. 2:00, he replied. And Edward, please don't mention this to anyone, especially family. That was when I knew. When you've lived long enough, you learn to recognize the precise moment when normal life ends and something else begins. The moment when context shifts, when old memories quietly reassemble themselves into new shapes. I hung up and stared at the wall for several minutes, my reflection faintly visible in the glass of a framed photograph. Laura and me, taken on a windswept beach in Maine, both of us squinting into the sun, her laugh caught mid-breath. She'd never mentioned another account. Not once. At 2:00, I sat across from Jonathan in his office, the same leather chair I'd occupied for decades. He slid a folder across the desk toward me without a word. Inside were bank documents, wire histories, correspondence, and one detail that immediately caught my eye. Authorized secondary contacts. 2 names. My son, Michael Mallory, and my daughter, Rachel Whitman. Jonathan watched my face carefully as I read. The account was established 18 months before Laura died, he said quietly. She was the sole beneficiary. However, limited transactional permissions were granted to Michael and Rachel. Not ownership, access. For what purpose? I asked. Jonathan folded his hands. That's unclear. What is clear is that transactions have occurred regularly since Laura's death. I looked up. How much? Jonathan exhaled. Just over $400,000. The room felt very still. Withdrawn. I asked. Transferred, he corrected, into a series of personal and business accounts connected to your children. I sat back slowly. Michael was 41, Rachel 38, both successful on paper. Michael ran a small consulting firm. Rachel was married to a financial advisor. They had never needed help from me, or so they said. When did you discover this? I asked. Last Thursday. The bank flagged irregular activity because the primary holder has been deceased for years. They contacted us because the trust documentation lists our firm as the legal oversight body. I nodded once, absorbing the information. Did Laura authorize this? I asked. Jonathan hesitated again. That's the question. He reached into the folder and removed a single envelope, yellowed slightly with age. My assistant found this inside the physical archive box linked to the account, he said. It wasn't scanned. It wasn't indexed, which suggests it was never meant to be part of the formal file. He placed it gently in front of me. Laura's handwriting was unmistakable. My name written neatly on the front. I didn't open it yet. What else haven't you told me? I asked. Jonathan met my gaze. There's evidence suggesting your children believe this account would eventually become theirs. In full. I felt no anger, no soak, just a quiet, settling certainty. Laura had always been more observant than people gave her credit for. I picked up the envelope. Give me copies of everything, I said calmly. And Jonathan, don't confront anyone. Not yet. He nodded. What are you planning? I stood. To find out when my children decided I was already dead. I didn't open Laura's letter when I got home. Not immediately. Some truths carry weight. Once lifted, they can't be set down again. I placed the envelope in the center drawer of my desk, locked it, and sat for a long time doing nothing at all. That evening, Michael called. The timing was precise enough to be impressive. Dad, he said warmly, as if we'd spoken the day before instead of 3 weeks ago. Just checking in. You sounded distracted last time we talked. I was reviewing paperwork, I replied. My voice was even, neutral. Still doing that estate stuff? He chuckled. You're the only retired guy I know who treats finances like a full-time job. Old habits, I said. Rachel called the next morning. Dot. Michael mentioned you sounded tired. Everything okay? I'm fine, I said. Just routine matters. There was a pause on the line. Fractional. Almost imperceptible. Well, she said lightly, if you ever want help organizing things, you know Ethan would be happy to look over anything. Free of charge. Ethan, her husband, a certified financial planner. I'll keep that in mind, I said. After we hung up, I wrote the date and time of both calls in a notebook I hadn't used in years. It was the same notebook I kept during my final projects as an engineer. Documentation, patterns, evidence. If Laura had learned anything from 40 years of marriage to me, it was that I didn't jump to conclusions. I verified them. Over the next week, I did nothing outwardly different. I attended my usual Wednesday breakfast at the diner off Route 206. Paid cash. Chatted with the same retired men about weather and local politics. I waved to my neighbor when he mowed his lawn. Inside, however, I was reconstructing the past 4 years with a new lens. Michael's consulting firm had expanded quickly after Laura's death. New office, new car. Rachel and Ethan had purchased a vacation property in Vermont 2 years earlier, despite previously mentioning cash flow limitations. At the time, I'd accepted their explanations. Promotions, smart investments, timing. I requested copies of the wire transfers from Jonathan's office and reviewed them line by line. The first transaction had occurred 6 weeks after Laura's funeral. $25,000. The memo field read, "Bridge loan, temporary." Then another, and another. Always justified, always temporary. By the time I finished tallying the amounts, the number felt abstract. Not because it was small, but because it had been taken slowly enough to disguise itself as normal. That, I realized, was the most disturbing part. No desesperación, no urgency, just planning. I opened Laura's letter on a Sunday morning. The house was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in the living room. I sat at the desk where she used to pay bills, her favorite pen still resting in the ceramic holder beside the lamp. "My dearest Edward," it began, "if you're reading this, then I was right to be careful." My hands were steady as I read. She wrote about overhearing a conversation during one of her treatments, about Michael and Rachel discussing what would happen after, about Ethan's reassurance that Dad won't notice if it's structured properly. She wrote that she didn't believe they thought of it as theft. They thought of it as inheritance in advance. I paused there, breathing slowly. She described setting up the account not to fund them, but to watch them, to see what they would do when they believed oversight no longer existed. "Edward," she wrote, "if they respect you, they will ask. If they don't, they will assume." She ended with a single instruction. "Don't confront them until you understand the full scope. Truth reveals itself when people think they're safe." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Laura had been dying, and she had still been protecting me. The following day, I hired a forensic accountant, not through Jonathan, through a separate firm recommended by an old colleague who'd once consulted on corporate fraud cases. Her name was Marianne Cole. Efficient, direct, unsentimental. "I don't need opinions," I told her during our initial meeting. "I need timelines, flows, and proof." She nodded. "That's usually how this ends." Over 3 weeks, Marian traced the money. Michael's firm had billed shell clients that didn't exist. Rachel's vacation home mortgage had been paid down with unexplained lump sums. Ethan had rerouted funds through advisory accounts he controlled. Every transfer was clean, legal-looking, and dishonest. "They coordinated," Marianne said, sliding her final report across my table. "This wasn't opportunistic. It was structured." "How confident are you?" I asked. She met my eyes. "Confident enough to testify." I thanked her and closed the folder. The last piece fell into place when Jonathan called again. "Edward," he said, "we've identified a clause in the original account documentation. It was designed to convert into a trust upon your death. Beneficiaries?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Your children." Equally. Laura hadn't set a trap. She built a mirror, and now I knew exactly what it reflected. Once you understand the shape of a betrayal, the hardest part isn't anger. It's restraint. For the next month, I said nothing. I didn't change my routines. I didn't cancel dinners. I didn't hint at suspicion. I allowed my children to continue believing exactly what they already believed, that I was predictable, solitary, and unaware. Michael invited me to lunch twice. I accepted once. We met at a bistro near his office. He talked at length about a major contract his firm was pursuing, the kind of story designed to sound impressive without ever becoming specific. At my age, he said casually, I'm thinking more about long-term security. You know how it is. Ido, he replied. Katan me chicken kerferi. Security matters. Rachel called the following weekend. Dad, Ethan and I were talking, she said. Have you ever considered consolidating your assets? Things are getting complicated these days. Are they? I asked. Well, with inflation, tax exposure, estate issues, it can get messy if things aren't structured efficiently. Messy, I repeated. She laughed lightly. You know what I mean. I did. After the call, I added another line to my notebook. Jonathan and I began preparing quietly. The first step was containment. We created an irrevocable trust, one that transferred ownership of my primary assets immediately, not at death. My house, my retirement accounts, my remaining investment portfolios, all moved under professional trusteeship. Once this is executed, Jonathan said, no one can pressure you into changes. Not family, not courts, not anyone claiming undue influence. Good, I said. I don't want influence. I want certainty. The trust beneficiaries were clearly defined. Not my children. Charitable organizations Laura and I had supported for decades. A scholarship fund in her name. And, per state law, the statutory minimum allocation to Michael and Rachel. $5,000 each. Jonathan raised an eyebrow when I approved it. You understand, he said carefully, that this will permanently alter your relationship with them. I nodded. They altered it years ago. I'm just documenting the change. Next came evidence. Marianne coordinated with Jonathan to ensure every document met admissibility standards. Bank records, email trails, transaction summaries, expert analysis. But proof on paper wasn't enough. People deny paper. They don't deny their own voices. Through a licensed investigator, we obtained authorization to monitor communications tied to the accounts in question. Not surveillance in the dramatic sense. Metadata, transaction-linked messaging platforms, recorded calls were legally permissible. It took 12 days. On the 13th, I received a call from Marianne. You should come in, she said. In her office, she played a recording. Michael's voice came through the speaker, relaxed and confident. He hasn't said anything, he told Rachel. That means we're in the clear. Rachel laughed. He never looks closely. He trusts us. Ethan's voice joined in. Once the trust converts, it's automatic. We just need to avoid spooking him. Michael replied, we won't. He's old school. Paper statements. Coffee at the same diner. He won't see it coming. I listened without moving. Not because it hurt, because it clarified. The final step was timing. I invited them all to dinner. Not abruptly, not suspiciously, just a message in the family group chat. Dinner at my place this Sunday. Nothing formal. I've been thinking about the future and want to talk. They responded within minutes. Michael, looking forward to it, Dad. Rachel, of course. We'll bring dessert. Ethan added a thumbs up. I placed my phone face down on the table. Sunday evening would be the end of uncertainty. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning resolution. I set the table the way Laura used to. Simple, orderly, nothing that suggested ceremony or confrontation. Roasted chicken, vegetables, a bottle of wine none of us commented on. The kind of dinner meant to feel ordinary. They arrived on time. Michael came first, confident, relaxed. Rachel followed with Ethan, smiling, carrying a box of pastries from a bakery I liked. They kissed my cheek, asked about my health, complimented the house. We ate. They talked. I listened. Michael described potential expansion plans. Rachel mentioned a possible refinance. Ethan spoke about market trends and legacy planning. When the plates were cleared, I stood and retrieved a small digital recorder from my desk. I placed it in the center of the table. I want to play something for you, I said. Michael frowned slightly. What's that? Just listen, I replied. I pressed play. Michael's voice filled the room. He never looks closely. He trusts us. Rachel's laugh followed. Ethan's voice. Once the trust converts, it's automatic. The silence afterward was immediate and total. Rachel's smile faded first. Michael stared at the table. Ethan's face tightened, the way professionals do when they realize a calculation was wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I know about the account, I said calmly. I know when it was created. I know how much you've taken. I know why. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dad, please, I said. Don't. I slid 3 folders across the table. Those contained bank records, transaction analyses, and expert reports. Everything has been reviewed by counsel. Rachel's hands trembled as she touched the folder but didn't open it. You weren't supposed to find out like this, she said softly. That's correct, I replied. I wasn't supposed to find out at all. Ethan leaned forward. Edward, this can be explained. There was no intent to harm you. The funds were reallocated. I finished. Without disclosure. Without consent. After my wife's death. He stopped speaking. I stood and walked to the sideboard, returning with a single envelope. Laura's letter. I read it aloud. Every word. Slowly. When I finished, Michael looked as though the room had tilted. She knew, he said. Yes, I replied. She did. Rachel began to cry. Quietly. Controlled. The way people cry when they're trying not to lose leverage. I didn't want to confront you, I continued. I wanted to understand you. Now I do. Michael stood abruptly. So what? You're cutting us off. I already have, I said. I handed Jonathan's prepared documents across the table. The irrevocable trust is executed. My assets are protected. Your future inheritance is fixed by law. Nothing you do will change it. Ethan's voice sharpened. You can't just. I can, I said. And I have. They read in silence. Michael's face reddened. This is punishment. No, Rapia. It's accountability. Rachel whispered. What happens now? That depends, I said, on how quietly you accept consequences. I pressed another button on the recorder. A second recording began. Transaction coordination. Account routing. Explicit intent. Ethan closed his eyes. I turned off the device. Legal proceedings begin Monday, I said. Recovery of misappropriated funds. Breach of fiduciary duty. Fraud. Michael stared at me. You're suing us. Yes. Rachel looked up. Dad, please. I met her gaze. I'm not angry, I said. I am finished. They didn't leave immediately. For several seconds after I finished speaking, no one moved. The air in the dining room felt heavier, as if the house itself were waiting to see what would happen next. Michael was the first to stand. You've made your point, he said, forcing control into his voice. Let's not do something irreversible. I looked at him calmly. That moment passed years ago. Rachel's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "If this goes to court," she said, "people will find out. Reputations will be damaged." "Yes," I replied, "they will." Ethan cleared his throat. "Edward, litigation is expensive, draining. It doesn't benefit anyone." "I disagree," I said. "It benefits clarity." I walked to the front door and opened it. "Dinner is over." They left without another word. Legal action began on Monday. Jonathan filed civil claims for financial exploitation, fraud, and breach of fiduciary responsibility. Mary Ann's analysis became the foundation of the case. The recordings were entered as corroborating evidence. Michael's attorney attempted negotiation. Rachel's attorney attempted sympathy. Ethan's attorney attempted delay. None succeeded. The judge ordered immediate asset freezes on accounts connected to the misappropriated funds. Subpoenas followed. Discovery uncovered internal communications that mirrored what I already knew. The numbers grew. What they had taken wasn't just 400,000. It was closer to 6. Interest, fees, opportunity cost. Each hearing was procedural, controlled, unemotional. I attended only the first. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. Rachel cried again, this time openly. Ethan resigned from his firm 2 weeks later. The court ruled in my favor. Full restitution, legal costs, penalties, payment schedules were imposed, liens placed, professional licenses reviewed. None of it brought me satisfaction, only finality. The house felt different afterward, quieter, larger. I donated Laura's old car, gave away furniture we no longer needed. I kept the photographs. On a warm spring afternoon, I sat in the backyard with a cup of coffee and watched the trees sway. The trust operated smoothly. Scholarships were funded. Charitable commitments fulfilled. I wrote one final entry in my notebook. Truth doesn't arrive loudly. It accumulates. That evening, I placed Laura's letter back in its envelope and locked it in the safe. I didn't need to read it again. I had listened the first time. The first summer after the ruling passed without ceremony. No calls. No unexpected visits. No apologies wrapped in legal language. The silence that followed felt earned, not empty. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next conversation, the next request disguised as concern. I sold the house in October, not out of necessity, but intention. It was too large for one person, too full of rooms that existed for a version of my family that no longer did. I moved 40 miles south, closer to the river, into a smaller place with wide windows and a study that faced the water. Every decision after that felt deliberate. I traveled alone for the first time in decades. Portugal in the spring, northern Italy in early summer. I walked through cities Laura and I talked about, but never prioritized. In each place, I wrote her name in a small notebook and left it on hotel desks I would never return to. The scholarship committee met monthly. I attended every meeting, reviewed applications, read letters from students who spoke about discipline, patience, responsibility. Qualities I recognized, qualities that didn't assume entitlement. I found peace in that. Michael sent one letter. No return address. No apology. Just a paragraph explaining that he felt misunderstood and pressured by circumstances. I read it once and shredded it without responding. Rachel sent nothing. I didn't block their numbers. They simply never called again. On the anniversary of Laura's death, I visited her grave. I brought coffee from a nearby cafe and sat on the bench we'd chosen together years earlier. I didn't speak aloud. There was nothing left to explain. She had trusted me to be calm. I had been. As I left, a young couple walked past, arguing quietly about directions. A man farther down the path was explaining something patiently to his daughter, her small hand wrapped around his finger. Life continuing. That evening, back in my new house, I opened the windows and let the sound of the river move through the rooms. I poured a glass of wine and sat at my desk. In my journal, I wrote the final line. Justice doesn't require anger. It requires attention. I closed the book. Outside, the water moved steadily past, indifferent to betrayal, untouched by inheritance, unconcerned with what had been lost or reclaimed. I turned off the light and let the quiet stay.